Now, we've been taught to believe that law is the foundation of freedom, but somehow or another in the last couple of decades, the land of the free has become a legal minefield. It's really changed our lives in ways that are sort of imperceptible, and yet when you pull back, you see it all the time. It's changed the way we talk. I was talking to a pediatrician friend in North Carolina. He said, well, you know, I don't deal with patients the same way anymore. You wouldn't want to say something off the cuff that might be used against you. This is a doctor whose life is caring for people. My own law firm has a list of questions that I'm not allowed to ask when interviewing candidates, such as the sinister question, bulging with hidden motives and innuendo, where are you from?
American society has become a labyrinth of lawsuits and liability, regulations and restrictions, which undermine liberty and muddy the waters of just plain old fun. Today, I am pleased to welcome a leader of legal reform in America to discuss how did this happen and how can we change it. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hi everyone, welcome to Timeless. I hope that you're having a great week. Just a reminder to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can stay notified every time I release a new segment or a timeless segment. And you can also follow me at Julie R. Hartman on Instagram and Twitter. Have you ever been at the doctor's office and you may have a scrape on your knee or some kind of discomfort and your doctor orders an MRI or some other kind of test that you feel like you don't need? We've all been in that situation, and it means that we are victims of this lawsuit culture that has come to permeate the United States. It is all around us in ways that we both see and don't see. For instance, here in this state of California, from which I am filming, a few decades ago, they banned having diving boards in one's backyard because supposedly it poses a liability risk for the owner. If you are a resident of Broward County, Florida, you were actually banned at one point from running around your playground in your public school. In many schools, there are over 50 steps to suspend a student. And even if you go on the playground and you don't see a seesaw, well, again, it's another symptom of this litigation lawsuit culture that we're living in. As I indicated in the introduction, I am so pleased to welcome someone who has dedicated his life towards trying to reverse this, just simplify the law so that we can live. This is Philip Howard. His books include The Collapse of the Common Good, How America's Lawsuit Culture Undermines Freedom, Sacred Cows, How Dead Laws Drag Down Democracy, Not Accountable, Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions, and he has other fabulous books on interesting subjects, including Try Common Sense, Replacing the Ideologies of Both Parties. Mr. Howard, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Great to be with you.
So how did you get interested in this subject?
I was always a public policy person. I worked at the Oak Ridge National Lab as a kid doing economics research, and I became a civic leader in New York after I went to law school. And I kept noticing that my friends in government couldn't do what they thought made sense. And I started looking into it, and I got more and more interested. And I eventually hired the brother of a friend who was an intellectual historian at Claremont to give me a tutorial in political philosophy, because I couldn't understand why things work so stupidly. And eventually, I had an insight, which we could talk about, and I wrote a book called The Death of Common Sense in 1995 that became like the big bestseller of the year. And I realized that no one else in the country had really bothered to look at how legal structures affect human behavior, and it's still a big problem.
Mm-hmm. When do you think this became a problem? Because when you started out your career, I imagine, not to offend you, it was probably a few decades ago. Was it as bad then as it is now?
I was there. I was sort of there at the formation. This is all a result of the 1960s rights revolution. We woke up to all these abuses in the 1960s, racism, pollution, unsafe cars, gender discrimination. And the legal geniuses not only wanted to change our values, which was a good idea, we needed to change our values, our legal values, but they wanted to create a legal system that would be wouldn't allow any bad decisions in the future. And so they came up with this idea of having 1,000-page rule books, not only telling people to have a safe workplace, but telling them exactly how to do it. And then we started letting anybody who didn't like anything to sue, claiming their rights were violated. And so all of a sudden, this lawsuit culture kind of exploded. People realized that they could game it to to make $1 million or something. And so, and the effect of both of these things, the kind of thick rule books and endless procedures and then lawsuits for everything, had the unintended effect of dramatically eroding our freedom.
Mm. It's interesting you say the 60s, you just mentioned a line that you also said in your famous 2010 TED Talk. You said in trying to eliminate bad values, the litigation culture has prevented people from exercising good values. This is all of the environmental lawsuits, medical lawsuits, etc. The 60s, I've done some reading on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it's certainly a hot topic to discuss, but if you don't mind, I'd like to discuss it for a moment. The Civil Rights Act is viewed as this great turning point in American history. And of course, on principle, I don't think anyone would disagree with the fact that African Americans, as well as white people, any race, should be allowed to go to the same schools, drink from the same water fountains, etc. But the problem, at least from my understanding with the Civil Rights Act, is that it allowed the state to have its influence and have its hand in any type of interstate commerce. That's what allowed it to prevent, for instance, segregated bathrooms. And this opened the door, from my understanding, of the government just being able to have a say in private businesses well beyond issues pertaining to civil rights. Is my understanding correct? Did the Civil Rights Act kind of kick this off?
I don't think so. I think that the what you're talking about is the reach of federal power broadly through the Interstate Commerce Clause. I think that was already in the works. I mean, they certainly used it in the Civil Rights Act. So that was, but I don't think the Civil Rights Act was the source of the overuse of federal law in that way. I think that you're raising a problem that's really a significant one that several thoughtful conservative philosophers have talked about, which is that we've created, through the federalization of everything, how to run a classroom, you name it, that we've created this kind of dumbbell society where we've got centralized laws and officials in Washington that are trying to dictate as much as possible what they think of as correct choices, instead of people being free to do things in their own way, on the one hand, which then, in a funny way, empowers individuals to be kind of, to have radical attitudes for themselves and to complain that anything they don't like is a violation of their individual rights. And what's been hollowed out is in the middle, which is the institutions of business, of community, of religious, churches and synagogues, where people used to have work together and have a sense of ownership with how the schools ran and how you perform social services. And all that's kind of been corroded so much that it almost doesn't exist, so that we have this world where people are increasingly alienated because they're not working with other people. They don't feel they have a sense of ownership of their lives. I'm just finishing an essay called Everyday Freedom, which proposes a new legal structure that empowers people to have the authority that goes along with whatever their responsibility is. And what we have instead is this world where you wake up in the morning and everything's beyond your control. You elect the mayor. The mayor has no authority over to fix a bad school. He can't fire a bad teacher. He can't fire a principal. He can't reallocate resources. That's what my new book, Not Accountable, about the public unions is about. What's the point of democracy if you elect somebody who's been disempowered from fixing things? So, so we have, we've created this crazy system that's really designed to fail.
You in your TED Talk, though you don't phrase it the way that I'm about to, you talk to or allude to the tyranny of the minority, that some of these lawsuits and restrictions, in legal cases are catering to someone who has a grievance. And when you're forming laws and when you're figuring out how to run a society, you need to judge a law mainly by its effect on society writ large, not just on a single individual with a grievance. You say, I love this quote, you say, quote, "You cannot run a society on the lowest common denominator." Can you provide a particularly stark example that we may see in our lives of this tyranny of the minority with regard to legal cases?
Sure. It's really everywhere. I mean, kids, the class doesn't go out on a field trip because one of the children is disabled and can't go on the field trip. So nobody gets to go. On college campuses, somebody claims that King Lear is offensive and creates an unsafe space, so they don't teach King Lear, or something crazy like that. It's, you mentioned in the introduction seesaws. Anything fun in a playground, seesaws, merry-go-rounds, all those things involve a modicum of risk. They also teach children how to take responsibility, and they get kids off the sofa to go and run around instead of becoming obese, which half the kids in the country are. So all those things, risk is what attracts people and kids to doing things. There's the kind of excitement of it, right? It's not a crazy risk, but those things have disappeared because there's no one, because judges no longer see it as their job to protect, to draw boundaries of what the reasonable freedoms of people are. So we have this kind of legal system by precautionary principle. Anything that might go wrong is banned. So we might as well all wrap ourselves in bubble wrap. It's like that Pixar movie WALL-E, where everybody gets fat and sits in a spaceship. People need agency. People need to be able to live their lives, and the law has to not simply cater to whoever has an accident or whoever feels differently. The law actually has to draw the boundaries of what reasonable norms are. And if you don't draw the boundaries, then what's happened is that people aren't free anymore.
If you don't mind, I want to play a part of your speech, clip 3, where you talk about how these laws, what you also call self-consciousness, prevents you from not just having fun, but really actualizing your potential as a person and an employee. Let's listen to it for a few seconds.
Life's complicated enough without legal fear, but law is different than other kinds of uncertainties because it carries with it the power of state. And so the state can come in. It actually changes the way people think. It's like having a little lawyer on your shoulders all day long, whispering in your ears, well, could that go wrong? Might that go wrong? It drives people from the smart part of the brain, that dark, deep well of the subconscious where instincts and experience and all the other factors of creativity and good judgment are. It drives us to the thin veneer of conscious logic. Pretty soon the doctor's saying, well, I doubt if that headache could be a tumor, but who would protect me if it were? So maybe I'll just order the MRI. Then you've wasted $200 billion in unnecessary tests. If you make people self-conscious about their judgments, studies show you will make them make worse judgments. If you tell the pianist to think about how she's hitting the notes when she's playing the piece, she can't play the piece. Self-consciousness is the enemy of accomplishment.
That point highlights that it's not, this lawsuit culture or this self-consciousness, as you say, is not just preventing a life of liberty and a life of fun, but it can also be potentially dangerous to, for instance, have a doctor that is so worried that he or she might be sued that he or she doesn't make a good medical decision.
Right. Makes people fail. So it does it. The law does this in several ways. Well, first, if you might get sued for a remote risk and no one will defend you, then people, it's human nature to be risk averse. Daniel Kahneman's written about this. So, people don't swim in the ocean because they're scared of a shark or whatever. So, so lawsuits have become the kind of shark, right? And so if you might get sued because you're, even if it's remote, if you let the kids go out and play alone in the backyard, you won't do it. You won't let them do it. So that's crazy. So people don't take reasonable risk. The second way law really messes up with people's brains is that if you tell people they have to comply with rules, what happens is they spend an enormous amount of energy with checklists. So if people are trying to go through a checklist with sort of pages and pages of things they have to comply with, that actually prevents them from focusing on doing the job. So there was this great example of how to fix this system a couple of decades ago. Australia had terrible nursing homes. They had 1,000 rules in the rule book. Somebody had the bright idea of getting rid of all the rules. And they replaced them with 31 general principles: how to have a home-like setting, respect the dignity of the residents. And the academics thought, oh, this is crazy. The nursing home operators were getting away with murder. Well, it turned out within a year, the nursing homes were twice as good. And they went and studied it. And what they found was that by letting people actually have the bandwidth to focus on the residents of the nursing home, all of a sudden, everything worked better, instead of them going through the day with their noses in rule books trying to comply with all the rules. Mm-hmm. The rules make people fail.
I totally agree with you from a consumer's perspective. But let's say I'm opening a business. Let's say I'm opening a charter school, for instance, and I want to put seesaws and slides and monkey bars. But then I think, I don't want to get sued. What if the kid falls and cracks open his head? Don't these laws protect a parent from potentially suing me? What's your response to that potential business owner?
Right, exactly. Well, you're not going to have those things because you're not going to take the risk. That's the problem. So we need to have this. We need to change the way law works. We need to have a set of norms, for example, for children's play, and a children's group should come up with them. And the courts need to see it as their job to protect those norms. By norms, I mean not 1,000 rules, but sort of reasonable risk for children at what age. And there are play experts who talk about what those should be and such. But we've lost our way as a society. I mean, what are the norms for telling a joke in the workplace? Should your career be ruined because you made a unfortunate joke, spontaneously in a workforce? I mean, people who do things spontaneously put their foot in their mouth sometimes. So, in a free society, people aren't allowed to apologize and get on with it, not have it be a federal case and get sued by somebody for creating an unsafe space.
So we're here now. We're in this tangled web of litigation and all these minute laws. How do we realistically reverse it? How do we untangle it?
We really need to have a national narrative, and maybe the narrative will be prompted by the fact that government is broke, and by the fact that these legacy bureaucracies and all the processes and lawsuits and everything else, are not affordable. I mean, we're wasting, pick a number, $1 trillion a year in systems that everybody knows are broken. I mean, 1/3 of the healthcare dollar goes to administration. That's over $1 trillion. That's over $1 million per doctor for red tape. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy, right? Everybody knows it's crazy. So why do we tolerate it? We can't afford it. So at some point we do have to have a reckoning, but the reckoning is not going to, and you could do it area by area, but I have this essay I'm working on. It's going to come out as a short book in the fall called Everyday Freedom. And it proposes a simplified structure with principles instead of rule books, where judges take it upon themselves when there's a lawsuit to make rulings of law as to what the reasonable risks are in that setting, and to dismiss claims, even if people are injured, to dismiss claims if that's the kind of risk people ought to be able to take in a free society. I'll give you an example. There was a famous case in England in the early 2000s where a young man ran into a public lake, dove too sharply, hit his head on the bottom, and was paralyzed for life. A terrible accident. He sued the county that owned the lake, the county park, and got a judgment because of a lot of money, because the risk was foreseeable. They had a lot of near accidents every year, blah, blah, blah. And in fact, the lake had been in the process of trying to close itself down to the public to prevent this risk, right? So it gets up to the England's version of the Supreme Court, and they dismissed the case. And they dismissed the case in a series of opinions. One judge said, does the law require that we cut down all trees because a child may climb it and fall out? It's our job to protect the reasonable risk of society, not to effectively ban people from enjoying the rivers and lakes of our society.
You can see
we have to draw these norms.
Forgive me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say, you can see where the culture is supplementing the law and vice versa, because we see now with pronouns, for instance, don't even assume someone's pronouns, don't even use a seemingly logical pronoun in case there's that one person that may not identify. It's exactly mimicked in the law.
Yeah, and what about my right? I don't have to use a pronoun that you want just because you want it. You can call me by any pronoun you want. People call me terrible things in my life. Do I have a legal claim against them? No. And so the similar thing about the pronouns, it's all this kind of one correct view fundamentalism, wokeness stuff is so totalitarian. On both sides, it's just so totalitarian. It's so contrary to the idea of people living in a free society. If you think somebody's obnoxious, you don't want to deal with them, then don't be their friend and don't act with them. But the free society, you can't ban them.
Yeah, there is such a thing as just shrugging off an insult or shrugging off a joke that you don't like. People nowadays don't see it that way. They think they have to go to HR, they have to go to the Supreme Court, they have to take an action. You were saying a few moments ago that the system is helplessly broken and everyone knows that it's broken. That's an example. I'll give you another one. You may know this individual or this blog. Are you familiar with David Priest, who is the Lawfare blog? So the Brookings Institute has this blog run by David Priest, and the blog itself is called Lawfare. It's a blog that talks about legal matters. That name, Lawfare, is creepy because lawfare is warfare, but use the law as a weapon of war to accomplish your ends. What does that say about a society or about someone who holds a law degree that would create a blog kind of openly endorsing the idea that law can be used as a weapon? Isn't that viewing the law as an outcome-driven process instead of a process-driven process?
Well, let's talk about that. So law is the foundation of freedom because it protects against abuse. It's not supposed to be a weapon for extortion or to get money from people. And the way law protects freedom is it's a concept of outer boundaries that are defining what's unlawful. And so think of freedom as a field, an open field within these outer boundaries where you can't steal, you can't pollute, you can't cheat people, whatever. But within in that field, people ought to be free to do whatever they want. And like atoms in a test tube, people bounce around and find people they like working with and dealing with and doing things with. Fine, that's what freedom is. And law is sitting there as a sentry, sort of like a security guard at the boundaries. And what's happened is that law no longer sets those boundaries. It kind of invades. It comes into the field of freedom and tries to mediate any dispute, anything it doesn't like, and that's lawfare. People come in and say, aha, I don't like that, so you owe me $1 million, or I'm going to ban you from doing this, or whatever. And of course, it's the opposite of freedom. Freedom is no longer law used that way is not it's not the framework for freedom. It's replacing freedom.
it's no longer about interpreting the law objectively. It's about getting the right outcome. I mean, I saw this in high school. There were so many students at my high school who wanted to get extra time on their tests, on their ACT and their SAT,
Right.
and they knew just the right doctor to go to or just the right lawyer to go to who would hand it to them on a silver platter. That is just blatant corruption. And so, yeah, we have to untangle this web, but it starts with restoring integrity for both the supply and demand side.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. So law is actually not generally objective. Law is a set of norms of reasonableness and of fair play and behavior. Somebody who games the system for disabilities to get extra time on a test so they can score better and get into a better school, ought to, when people know that they don't really have that disability, they ought to be called on the carpet for that, not allowed to do that. And that's should be a judgment call by the people in charge of the school or in charge of the test or whatever. And the doctor who's giving those things ought to be called before the professional licensing bureau or whatever. So law is about norms, the Constitution, what's an unreasonable search and seizure, what are the protections of free speech, tort law, reasonable behavior, the reasonable person standard, sort of, is it reasonable to go fast when you're taking someone to the hospital? Yes. Is it reasonable to go 100 miles an hour when you're just getting to your golf game? The answer to that is no. We need to accept the fact that law is a social institution, and first, that it's not a mediator of daily disputes, and secondly, that when it's gamed, the people who game it should be accountable. Instead, we treat the game. So, by treating law as an objective process, people say, well, they got the doctor's certificate. The doctor said so, and that's when the process allows them to do that. So they should be allowed to take extra time, even though everybody knows the person is not, doesn't have learning disabilities. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not fair. So you can't run an organization just by following the rules and have it be fair, because everyone's going to game it, and that's what's happened.
You raise an interesting point that law is in a way subjected to the subjective view of the lawyer or enforcer of the law. I'm recalling a quote that John Adams said about the United States. It was something along the lines of, the United States unbridled by morality and religion will break the strongest cords of our Constitution like a whale going through a net. In other words, we need to agree on a common set of norms and have a certain set of values to which we prescribe, because we are going to encounter statutes that say reasonableness. Well, what is reasonableness? We are going to encounter parts of the law where it is going to be incumbent upon the subjective interpreter to subjectively interpret. So it appears to me that we have to get back to this place of having the shared values so that we're interpreting those subjective parts of the law with good judgment.
Right. And where do we get those shared values? I'll tell you where we get them. We get them from authority structures. They don't rise spontaneously. There is no shared value for almost anything in a pluralistic society. Someone on behalf of society, legislatures pass laws, judges interpret laws, officials apply laws, all of those things by people who have the authority to do whatever their job is, become the norms.
What about religion?
Religion is the basis for the norms often, but religion itself doesn't have authority. So, one of the great tragedies of the post-1960s legal system is that it was designed to prevent abuses of authority by getting rid of authority. Well, in fact, you don't have any freedom worthy of the name unless people have the authority that goes along with their responsibility. The school's not going to work if the principal can't make the decision about who's a good teacher and who's not.
Right.
The classroom's not going to work if the teacher doesn't have the authority to decide who's disrupting the classroom and get them out of there. Then nobody can learn. So if you recreate the authority that goes along with someone's responsibility, what's a reasonable risk? That's normally going to be decided either by a judge or maybe by, somebody who's running the safety agency or something. That's the norm. That's where the norm comes from. You're not going to get the norm by sitting around a living room, and say, well, is this a reasonable risk or is that a reasonable risk? I mean, people need institutions, the institution's law to make those choices. And if we don't like them, we can elect new people and change the law. But authority has kind of it's funny about authority. We think of authority as sort of Attila the Hun or something. But when you're talking about the authority at the boundaries of law, you're not talking about telling people what to do. You're just saying, this is how far you can go and no further. So it's not like having a dictator around. And those judgments have to be applied in context, like the kid who's not learning disabled claiming he needs extra time. Well, he's never been learning disabled before in high school, so why does he need the time all of a sudden for this standardized test? It's just not fair to anybody.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to leave you with a G.K. Chesterton quote. Are you familiar with G.K. Chesterton?
I am.
I recently read his book Orthodoxy, and there was this quote in it that I think perfectly synopsizes your message. He said, imagine there's an elevated island, and there are children playing on this island. If you have a border around the island, then children can play in it and freely, and they'll go all the way to the edges of the raised island, and they'll feel comfortable doing so because they have this border. But imagine you take away those strict borders, i.e. of the law, and you just have nothing. They're all going to be huddled in the center. In other words, this free-for-all that we see, without just some clear norms that we can all establish, this free-for-all is causing us all to huddle and prevent our actualization and, as I said in the intro, just plain fun.
Yeah, that's right. We've created the defensive society.
Yes.
So, when in doubt, don't. And so people won't feel free to take reasonable risk, introduce new products, take all the stupid warning labels off the coffee cups.
Yeah.
People won't feel free to do any of those things until they have a system of law that they trust.
We are constantly bombarded with labels, and you know what? It's making us stupid. If you don't know that your coffee cup is hot, you'll go to Starbucks and they'll say, caution, this is hot. If you don't know that it's hot, you probably need to go back to elementary school.
Well, it's worse than making us stupid, because it's the version of The Boy Who Cried Wolf. So when there's so many labels, no one reads any of them. And there are some products that probably do need labels.
You're right.
But we can't distinguish between those and the stupid labels on coffee cup.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Howard, thank you so much for coming on to the show. It's been a delight talking with you about an undelightful subject, but certainly something we have to be aware of. Next time we'll talk about your book. We didn't even get to it on public employee unions. For those who are interested, it's Not Accountable, Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions. Go ahead, my friend. I'm just
nice
publicizing
to be with
your book. Sorry?
It's nice to be with you.
Thank you. Take care. See you soon.
Yeah, goodbye.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. We got to bring back diving boards in our backyards. Maybe I'll create an online petition to revive the swim fun. Reminder, please hit subscribe. Revive the dive, which Sean said. We should really start that. Put that on some mugs. Just a reminder, hit the subscribe button down below. You can follow me at Julie R. Hartman, and I'll see you soon. Take care.